Hi, hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Today we will talk about Sylvia Plath's novel, The Bell Jar. The Bell Jar, 1963. Sylvia Plath, 1932-1963. The Bell Jar is Sylvia Plath's only novel published under the pseudonym Victoria Lucas during her lifetime. It is a semi-autobiographical work drawing heavily on Sylvia Plath's own experiences with the mental illness, especially her 1953 breakdown and hospitalization. Plath wrote the novel partly as a therapeutic exercise and partly to critique the oppressive social roles imposed on women in the 1950s. And it reflects her struggles with the depression, identity, and societal expectations, issues that shaped much of her poetry. Now let's analyze the title of the book. The bell jar metaphor represents a suffocating, isolating mental state, like being trapped under a glass dome, cut off from the outside world. It symbolizes Esther Greenwood's descent into mental illness, where reality becomes distorted and she feels paralyzed by her own mind. The bell jar also implies the claustrophobic social conventions and pressures that confine the character Esther, particularly the limitations placed on women. Structure and division of the book. The novel does not have formal structure, but can be divided roughly into 4 thematic parts, tracing Esther's psychological journey. Part first, New York and early ambitions. Esther, a promising 19-year-old writer, wins a prestigious internship at a New York fashion magazine. Despite external success and glamour, she feels alienated and detached from the world around her. This section highlights the tension between external appearances and internal despair. Part 2. Return home and a psychological decline. After the internship, Esther returns to her family home in suburban Boston. She feels increasingly disconnected and depressed, overwhelmed by expectations of marriage and domesticity. Esther's mental health deteriorates. She experiences suicidal thoughts and emotional numbness. Part 3. Hospitalization and treatment. Following a suicide attempt, Esther is hospitalized and is subjected to electroconvulsive therapy (ECT). The narrative explores the failings and harsh realities of mid-20th century psychiatric treatment. This part is critical of the medical establishment's impersonal approach and a societal ignorance about mental illness. Now part 4, recovery and ambiguous hope. After treatment, Esther slowly begins to regain her sense of self. The novel ends on an ambiguous note with Esther planning to face the outside world again but unsure of what the future holds. This reflects a fragile hope rather than a clear resolution. Now let's discuss the key themes. Mental illness and depression. Central to the novel is the portrayal of clinical depression and the subjective experience of psychosis. Sylvia Plath gives a nuanced and authentic depiction of the despair, confusion, and isolation caused by mental illness. The narrative challenges stigmas and the misunderstandings about psychiatric disorders. The next theme, female identity and societal expectations. The novel critiques the restrictive role available to women in the 1950s, such as marriage, motherhood, and a domesticity. Esther resists the idea that a woman's value lies solely in conforming to societal norms. The book explores the conflict between personal ambition and a social pressure. Next theme, alienation and isolation. Esther's alienation from her fears, family, and even herself permeates the novel. The bell jar metaphor encapsulates this sense of entrapment and emotional numbness. This theme connects to wider post-war anxieties and existential dislocation. Next theme, search for identity and meaning. Esther's journey is ultimately about finding her own voice and a sense of self amidst chaos. The novel reflects a building's romance, a coming-of-age story complicated by mental illness. It critiques false ideals and encourages self-exploration. Next theme, critique of psychiatric treatment. The novel highlights the limitations and often brutal nature of psychiatric care in the 1950s. Treatments like ECT are portrayed ambiguously, both terrifying and sometimes helpful. It reveals the dehumanizing effects of the medical system on patients. Now let's analyze the key characters. Esther Greenwood. The protagonist, a young woman struggling with a depression and the pressures to conform. The next character, Dr. Gordon, Esther's psychiatrist, symbolizing the medical authority. The next character, Buddy Willard, Esther's boyfriend, representing traditional masculine ideas and societal expectations. The next character, Doreen, Esther's rebellious friend, embodying a freer, less conventional lifestyle. Next, Mrs. Greenwood, Esther's mother, who represents familial expectations and the domestic ideal. Now let's talk about the key arguments and literary importance of the work. The Belcher argues for the importance of recognizing mental illness as a serious, complex condition beyond a stigma. It exposes the limited anti-gender roles available to women, questioning societal norms. Sylvia Plath critiques the clinical antisocial mechanisms that alienate individuals, especially women. The novel is considered a pioneering work of confessional literature and a feminist critique. Its psychological depth and a poetic prose make it a bridge between Plath's poetry and fiction. Now let's talk about the current relevance of the work. The bell jar remains a touchstone in mental health literature, studied for its candid depiction of depression. Its critique of gender roles resonates with the ongoing feminist debates about identity, autonomy, and societal expectations. The novel is frequently included in academic curricula addressing women's literature, psychology, and a 20th century American culture. In a time of growing awareness about mental health, novel's portrayal of isolation and institutional care continues to inspire dialogue and empathy. The bell jar metaphor is widely used to describe emotional suffocation, making the novel culturally iconic. Now let's discuss the main chords. First one. I took a deep breath and listened to the old brag of my heart. I am. This chord expresses the narrative's affirmation of existence amidst her struggles with depression. It reflects a moment of raw, persistent self-awareness and a survival despite feeling trapped. The next chord. The trouble was, I had been inadequate all along. I simply have not thought about it. Esther's admission reveals her internalized feelings of failure and self-doubt that fuel her mental illness. It highlights the pervasive impact of societal and personal expectations on her psyche. The next quote: if you expect nothing from somebody, you are never disappointed. This cynical observation captures Esther's defense mechanism against emotional pain and rejection. It speaks to her growing alienation and a protective detachment from others. The next quote: the silence depressed me. It was not the silence of silence, it was my own silence. Here, Esther distinguishes between external quiet and the internal void she experiences. It underscores how isolation amplifies her despair and alienation. The next quote: to the person in the bell jar, blank and stopped as a dead body, the world itself is a bad dream. The bell-jar metaphor describes Esther's feeling of suffocation and disconnection from reality. This encapsulates the core theme of mental illness as a barrier to experiencing life fully. The next quote: I saw my life branching out before me like the green fig tree in the story. This metaphor reflects Esther's paralysis when faced with multiple life choices and her fear of making the wrong decision. It captures the anxiety and indecision that can accompany mental distress. The next quote: I wanted to crawl out of my skin. This visceral statement conveys Esther's intense discomfort with herself and her mental state. It shows her desperate desire to escape from the confines of her identity and suffering. The next quote: I felt very still and very empty, the way the eye of a Toronto must feel. The simile evokes a paradox of calmness amid chaos, mirroring Esther's mental state. It highlights the quiet but powerful turmoil inside her. The next quote: the only thing I feared was fear. This quote illustrates the cyclical nature of Esther's anxiety, where fear itself becomes the source of her suffering. It emphasizes the self-perpetuating aspect of mental illness. The next quote: I wanted to be where nobody I knew could ever come. Esther's desire for complete isolation reflects her alienation and a desperation to avoid a judgment or intrusion. It reveals the depth of her psychological pain and a need for escape. Now the next quote: I felt my lungs inflate with the onrush of scenery, air, mountains, trees, people. This moment of sensory awareness contrasts with Esther's usual detachment, symbolizing a brief return to life and hope. It shows how nature and surroundings can momentarily alleviate despair. The next quote: I took a deep breath and listened to the old brag of my heart. I am. It is repeated because of its thematic importance. This repeated assertion of existence reaffirms Esther's survival despite overwhelming darkness. It symbolizes resilience and the fragile but a persistent spark of life. The next quote: wherever I sat, on the deck of a ship or at a street cafe in Paris or Bangkok, I would be sitting under the same glass bell jar, stewing in my own sour air. The Belter metaphor extends beyond place to a universal condition of mental entrapment. It conveys the inescapable nature of her depression, regardless of external circumstances. The next quote, I couldn't see the point of getting up. I had nothing to look forward to. This bleak statement conveys the hopelessness at the heart of Esther's depression. It captures the crushing loss of motivation and meaning that defines her mental state. The next quote, the instant I saw the world in all its cruelty, I shut the door on it. This quite highlights the Esther's instinct to protect herself by withdrawing from reality. It shows how trauma and awareness can lead to emotional shutdown as a coping strategy.